Thank you all very much for coming this afternoon. I'm Liz Perry, the director of the Harvard-Yenching Institute, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the 2017 annual roundtable of the Institute. It's an event that we've been organizing for the past 7 years, an event that brings scholars from different countries in Asia here to Harvard to consider topics of Asia-wide significance. We generally time this roundtable to coincide with the Association for Asian Studies annual meeting because the Harvard-Yenching Institute sponsors a keynote speaker from Asia at the Association for Asian Studies annual meeting, and then we invite that keynoter to come to Harvard and organize a roundtable that hopefully bears some relationship to the interests of the keynote speaker. This year, we were very fortunate to have as our keynote speaker Professor Zhang Longxi from the City University of Hong Kong, who you'll be hearing from shortly. He delivered an address last week in Toronto entitled Asian Studies, Interdisciplinarity, and Comparative Work. And today's roundtable is entitled Asian Studies in Asia. We will try to examine area studies focused on Asia as they are practiced at universities and research institutes within Asia. Now, here in the United States, we often think of area studies as a post-World War II Cold War phenomenon. After all, it was in the 1950s that the United States government and also the Ford Foundation began to give substantial amounts of money to support the study of the languages, cultures, societies, politics, economies of countries that were considered a potential national security threat to the United States in the context of the Cold War. Here at Harvard in 1955, the Center for East Asian Research was established, a center that today, over decades of evolution, is the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. A few years after that, in 1958, the US government passed Title VI of the National Defense Education Act, which provided a substantial amount of money for the study of foreign languages, again associated with countries that were considered to be potentially of some geopolitical national security concern to the United States. I myself would never have gotten through graduate school if it weren't for the support of an NDA fellowship. I think that's true probably for a number of other Harvard faculty in this room. The NDEA Act in 1958 also funded national resource centers across the United States for area centers, and that was followed a couple of years later by the Fulbright-Hays Act, which provided other congressional support for the study of area studies and foreign languages. So this is usually how we think about area studies as it developed in the United States, and then we ask, okay, even though it started with a clearly political national security interest, what has it brought us academically and intellectually? How can we claim it and reshape it in a way that makes sense to us? But I think it's also worth remembering, especially because this roundtable is organized by the Harvard-Yenching Institute, that here at Harvard, 30 years before this Cold War development of area studies, there was another very interesting experiment in area studies that has lasted down to the present and that was embodied in the Harvard-Yenching Institute. The Harvard-Yenching Institute was originally actually known as the Harvard-Yenching Institute for Chinese Studies. It was founded in 1928 with a generous endowment, not from either the US government or the Ford Foundation, but from the estate of one man, Charles Martin Hall, who had founded the Aluminum Company of America. and who left money to support higher education in Asia. This earlier experiment in area studies, in Asian studies, reflected the influence not of the American national security community, but rather two intellectual academic communities, one located in Europe, European sinology, especially as it was being practiced there in France under the direction of the sinologist Paul Pelliot. The other very important international current at the time was occurring in China, known as national learning, or guoxue. Chinese translated what was going on in Europe as hanxue, or sinology, but what was going on in their own country as guoxue, or national learning, particularly as it was practiced after 1922 at Peking University under the direction of Hu Shi. These national learning centers in China, first at Beida, but then soon after at Tsinghua, and then in what became Central University in Nanjing, were very interesting movements that came out of the May 4th movement, the New Cultural Movement, which we often think of as an anti-Chinese tradition movement. But of course, Hu Shi and these other intellectuals then embraced the study of Chinese culture and Chinese civilization to see what they could rescue from it through the use of new modern methods for the study of Chinese culture. When the Harvard-Yenching Institute was established here in Cambridge in 1928, the Harvard student newspaper, The Crimson, wrote a very interesting article, I think, that explained the mission of this new institute. And I'll read you just one paragraph from the Crimson article, which came out on January 10th of 1928. I think it's quite interesting because it shows us a vision of area studies that is truly global, that's truly international, that's truly complementary, and that saw the rising nationalism in China of the 1920s as a positive force that might be harnessed for greater international appreciation of Chinese civilization. So the Harvard Crimson story explained things this way. The purpose of the new Harvard-Yenching Institute of Chinese Studies is to promote both in China and in America graduate study and research in the various branches of Chinese culture with the primary objective of encouraging the Chinese to study their own highly developed civilization in the light of Occidental methods of research, and for them to interpret this civilization to the West. It will thus be made possible in China for Yenching University to offer graduate work to its own students and to those who come from other parts of China, and thus assist in strengthening the emphasis on Chinese culture, which is one of the beneficial consequences of the recent nationalistic awakening among Chinese students. The work here at Harvard will consist of courses in the Chinese language and literature, as well as in various aspects of sinology studied through the medium of English or European languages, unquote. So I think this is a rather interesting conception of area studies developed in the 1920s in the interwar period between the First and Second World War, when there was a rising tide of globalization and a fascination with retrieving the civilizational values of various different world cultures. This is also the time when the History of American Civilizations was founded here at Harvard, the first American Studies program in the United States. Reflecting the influence of both Chinese and European scholarship, the trustees of this new institute first turned to Hu Shi at Beida and invited him to be the first founding director of the Harvard-Yenching Institute. Wisely, perhaps, Hu Shi declined them. The trustees then turned to France, to Paul Pelliot, and invited him to be the founding director of the Institute. He was also a very wise sinologist, and he too turned them down. But Paul Pelliot recommended his student, Sergei Eliseev, Russian by birth, who had been trained under Pelliot in Paris, but who was also the first foreigner to graduate from Tokyo Imperial University. And Eliseev readily accepted and served as director of the Institute for the next 2 decades. During that period, his focus was on building up first-rate library collections, both at Yenching University in Beiping and also here at Harvard University, the Harvard-Yenching Library. His focus was also on developing leading academic journals in Asian studies at both universities. And primarily promoting the study of Chinese culture with modern Western techniques. The famous Harvard-Yenching Sinological Index series, under the direction of William Hong at Yenching University, was a kind of precocious example of an attempt to use computer-like approaches, classificatory coding, before the advent of the computer itself, in order to render Chinese classical texts intelligible to modern readers who had grown up without memorizing them. The objective was to promote the awareness of Chinese culture, both in China and in the West, at a time, a moment in history, when it looked as though the rising tide of revolution was threatening appreciation for the value of Chinese civilization. But from the very beginning, the Harvard-Yenching Institute emphasized placing Chinese studies in a broader context, the context of Asian studies more broadly. Harvard-Yenching from the beginning established at Yenching University a Sino-Indian institute under the directorship of Baron Alexander von Stael-Holstein, born in Estonia, but educated in Germany. And the Baron taught both at Harvard and in Beiping, looking at comparisons between Chinese, Sanskrit, and Tibetan versions of Buddhist texts. In the 1950s, when it was no longer possible for the Harvard-Yenching Institute to operate in mainland China, because, of course, of the victory of the Communist Revolution a few years earlier, the Institute then expanded its activities across much of Asia. Initially, the logic was to focus on the Confucian and Buddhist parts of East and Southeast Asia. Over time, the rationale for supporting studies broadened and moved beyond philological, religious, philosophical concerns to include comparisons along all dimensions of the humanities and social sciences. As we all know, in the last half century or so, Asia has become more of a self-conscious and coherent unit. Beginning with the founding in the 1960s of ASEAN and then the expansion in the 1990s, ASEAN +3, adding China, Japan, and Korea to those Southeast Asian countries. Also, as far back as the 1960s, the Asian Development Bank. Then in the 1980s, the formation of APEC. Most recently, under Chinese auspices, of course, the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. All of these were, and to some extent remain, controversial initiatives pushed by various economic and political interests, but all of them have helped to contribute to a sense of Asia as an increasingly coherent region economically. Culturally, of course, we've seen in recent years Asian pop culture in the form of karaoke and anime from Japan, K-pop and the Korean wave from Korea and so forth, initially creating a sense of Asian pop culture and then, of course, reaching out to claim much of the rest of the world. This raises a question, which is the question of this panel today, the question of how we should think about Asian studies today in the 21st century, a time when Asian studies are being revived and rethought within Asia itself. Should we prioritize country-specific studies, studies of China, Japan, Korea, and so on? Should we prioritize Asia-wide regional studies? Should we think about area studies in global terms as part of transnational patterns of migration and the like? What role should language play, language study, in these various initiatives? the recent controversy on social media in China over the establishment of the Yinyang Academy, the Yinyang Xuetang, at Peking University, which of course offers a one-year master's degree in Chinese studies in Peking University taught in English. That recent controversy over whether it was appropriate to teach Chinese studies in English at Peking University is a wake-up call to all of us, I think. One, of course, can make a logical argument that Chinese studies at Peking University should be taught in Chinese. One can make an equally important argument that teaching Chinese studies in English in China draws an audience from around the world that's very valuable, not only to Chinese soft power, but actually to increasing a more aware constituency around the world. One can also make the argument that if the core of Chinese studies is still the Confucian classics, then what is the advantage of teaching Wenyan in Baihua? What is the advantage of teaching a literary language in colloquial Chinese when they don't really bear all that much relationship to one another? And if one can teach literary Chinese in contemporary Chinese, after all, literary Chinese was the written language of Japan and Korea and Vietnam for a very long period of time, so why not teach classical Chinese in Japanese or in Korean or in Vietnamese? Similarly, for those of us in the English-speaking world, do we have to teach Chaucer's Old English in modern English, when those of us who speak and read modern English can't hope to really understand Chaucer in the original? What difference does it make if we teach him in English or teach him in Chinese or teach him in Japanese or teach him in Korean? So these are complicated matters. They're not obvious. They're not straightforward. They raise not only academic and intellectual issues, but they also raise issues that touch on national identity and on geopolitical power, soft power, and so forth. We're very fortunate today to have a panel of distinguished scholars whose members have thought about these kinds of issues from various different perspectives, and to have them here to talk to us at this moment when Asian studies are being rethought within Asia. We have a panel of 4 scholars from Asia: Professor Hirano from Japan, Professor Pak from Korea, Professor Wang from China, and Professor Zhang from Hong Kong. And we will go by general consensus in alphabetical order here. So I'm first going to invite in just a moment Professor Hirano.